I turned the lock on the bathroom door and listened. The old fridge hummed in the kitchen, the house groaned in its sleep, but Silas was quiet. He had either left early or was still buried under the weight of another night's bottle. Either way, the silence gave me a few precious minutes alone. The mirror didn't lie. My cheekbone had faded from purple to a sickly yellow, my lip had split again. I dabbed it gently with a cloth, then reached for powder, brushing it on like a fragile mask. A little lipstick, soft pink, more for disguise than beauty. I adjusted the blouse collar to hide the bruise near my collarbone fingers, trembling from arthritis, and something heavier. I forced a polite smile at the stranger in the glass, slipped my worn rosary into my pocket, and opened the door. The smell of burnt coffee hit first, then his voice, already angry, already awake. Silas used to laugh in the mornings. I still remember his small hand wrapped in mine as we walked to church, his crooked smile just like his father's. After Daniel died, it was only me at 29, a widow with no degree, and a little boy who thought the moon rose just for him. I told myself I would give him everything, no matter the cost. I gave up the scholarship letter I had saved in a drawer since high school. I sold the piano Daniel had once loved to hear me play. I let friendships fade into silence. I worked double shifts cleaning motel rooms at night and waiting tables at dawn. I carried laundry in one arm and groceries in the other, saving nickels for his birthday gifts, aching through each day, but smiling for him. When Silas was 8, I saved for 3 months to buy him a bike. He hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. When he was 12 and said he wanted to quit church, I didn't argue. I thought, maybe that's how boys grew. Maybe I was holding too tightly. The slipping began quietly, silence, then anger, then broken plates. By the time he was 19, he stopped calling me mama. I became you, then old woman, then problem. People excused it as grief for his father. But I grieved too, and I did not turn cruel. He drowned his days in drink-lost jobs, blamed me for every failure. I still hear him sneer. You held me back. You raised me in your sad little world. That night I cried in the closet so he wouldn't hear. Still I stayed because beneath the bitterness I kept searching for the little boy who once brought me dandelions wrapped in tin foil. Over time, I learned to lock my bedroom door. I stopped leaving my hairbrush on the dresser. I stopped expecting apologies. I survived one day at a time. That morning, I set his coffee and eggs on the table, but he never looked up from his phone. You always were good at playing servant, he muttered, scrolling jaw tight. You used to cook better, before you got old and useless. I said nothing. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours, my hands ached too much to peel potatoes, but excuses never mattered. He shoved his plate aside, fork scraping. Then came the words that always landed like stones. It should have been you, not him. He meant Daniel. He always meant Daniel. My hand shook and knocked a plate to the floor. It shattered. Silas leapt up, barking. You can't even hold a damn plate. I bent slowly, knees stiff, gathering shards, while he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting. Curtains shifted across the street. Someone had heard, as they always did. But no one came. I went to my room and lit the stub of a candle on my makeshift altar. The chipped image of Mary leaned against the wall. I pressed the rosary to my lips and prayed not for escape, not even forgiveness, just for enough strength to last another day. The flame flickered as if answering back. Later, I took the week's last bag of food, bruised apples, 2 cans of beans, a loaf of day-old bread, and started toward St. Martha's. My knees fought each step. At the base of the church steps they gave out. I fell, apples scattering across the concrete. Strong but gentle hands steadied me. A man knelt beside me, his eyes soft and steady. Not flinching, even when he saw the bruise peeking from my scarf. He gathered my scattered food like it was something holy and pressed a folded note into my hand. Then he walked away before I could speak. On the paper was a single verse, Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Inside the church, the stained glass scattered colored light across the pews. I sat in the back, clutching the note as if it might dissolve if I let go. I read it again and again, the words sinking somewhere deep, and I didn't yet know I would see him again the very next day. The knock came just after 10:00 a.m. I had barely finished sweeping the porch more out of habit than purpose when I heard it. The sound was patient, steady, almost respectful. I cracked the door and saw him sun-worn boots, a dark beard, and the same steady eyes as the day before. In his hands, he carried a paper sack and something wrapped in cloth. "Thought you might not have eaten yet," he said quietly. "The bakery had these fresh this morning. I should have said no." Silas had made it clear, no visitors, no strangers, no explanations. But I didn't close the door. Instead, I asked his name. "Malachi Rivera?" he said, nodding toward the loose gate, hanging at the fence line. "That thing's been leaning a while. I could fix it if that's all right." I wanted to protest, to tell him no, but the bread smelled warm through the cloth, and the verse he'd given me still sat in my pocket like a living thing. I stepped aside. "You don't have to," I murmured. He smiled gently, setting the sack on the porch. "God didn't send me to rescue you," he said. "Just to stay." Without another word, he pulled tools from a pouch and went to work on the gate, his movements calm and certain, as if he belonged there. I watched from the porch chair, the warm bread in my lap, my heart unsettled by the quiet way he moved. That's when I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a car door, the heavy stomp of boots. Silas. His eyes narrowed when he saw Malachi. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped. Malachi straightened, wiping his hands. "Just helping with the gate." "This is my house," Silas barked. "You don't fix a damn thing without asking me first." The air grew tight. I braced for the storm. But Malachi didn't flinch. "I asked her," he said simply. For a moment, they locked eyes, anger clashing against calm. Then Silas scoffed, stormed past me into the house, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Malachi gathered his tools, nodded once to me, and said, "I'll come back tomorrow." That gate still leaned, but his words lingered like a promise. That night, the shouting began again. I heard the bottle cap hit the floor hours before the storm broke. His voice rose and fell, sometimes calling my name, sometimes his father's, sometimes cursing shadows only he could see. I pressed my back to the locked door, listening. At last, silence. I crept to the bathroom, cold floor against my feet, headlight hands trembling. I turned on the dim light and reached for the faucet, but the mirror blurred. My knees buckled. My hips struck the tub, my head the floor. Pain flared, then faded into nothing. My last thought was a desperate whisper. "Not like this." When I opened my eyes, the world was two bright voices moving like waves, sirens, machines, hands on mine, warm, steady, familiar. "It's all right now," Malachi whispered. "You're not alone anymore." His face came into focus, slowly blurred like a dream. My body felt heavy, too weak to speak. Later, they told me what happened. Malachi had come back that morning like he said he would. When I didn't answer, he waited, then listened. Something told him it wasn't right. Mrs. Langley, my neighbor, heard him shouting for me. She fetched her son, and together they forced the door. They found me on the bathroom floor, blood trailing like a ribbon from my head pulse, faint breath, shallow. The paramedics said it was a miracle I hadn't slipped away entirely. 10 minutes later, and it might have been too late. I don't remember the ride to the hospital, but I remember Malachi's coat sleeve against my arm as he held my hand in the ambulance, whispering, "Stay with me. Please stay." In the hospital room, machines hummed softly. Shadows flickered against the walls, and I drifted in and out of sleep, always with the echo of his voice pulling me back. When I woke again, there was a piece of paper on the nightstand neatly smoothed, as if placed with care. It was the same verse he had given me days before. Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. I traced the words with trembling fingers, and for the first time in years, I believed they might be true. For 2 days, I rested more than I had in years. Nurses came and went, soft voices, asking questions I barely heard. Malachi visited every afternoon, always at the same time. He never said much, just sat quietly by the window presence, steady as sunlight. On the third day, I heard his voice in the hallway, speaking low with another man. Later, Father Emmett, the priest from St. Martha's, came to see me. He sat gently at my bedside, folding his hands. "Malachi told me a story," he said. "He said you wouldn't remember it, but he does. He said, when he was 9, living behind a gas station, you found him near the dumpster. You gave him bread, a Bible from your purse, sat with him for 5 minutes, asked his name, and told him God hadn't forgotten him." I searched my memory, but the image was blurred, lost among years of small kindnesses I had offered strangers. But something about it rang true, something about the way Malachi had looked at me. Not with surprise, but with recognition. Father Emmett's voice softened. He told me, "She saved me once. Now it's my turn." The words landed quietly, but I felt them echo through me. I may not have remembered that boy behind the gas station, but I understood what he meant. Sometimes the seeds you plant bloom years later, long after you've forgotten the soil. The shelter wasn't much, just a converted house at the edge of town, with floors that creaked, lights that flickered softly, and walls soaked with too many memories. But it was quiet, and it was safe. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking to footsteps or slamming doors. They gave me a room of my own, with a small dresser and a bed that didn't tremble beneath anger. In the top drawer, I found a tin of thread and an old sewing hoop someone had left behind. My hands weren't steady anymore, but the motion returned like an old hymn, slower but familiar. Each stitch was a prayer I couldn't yet speak. The women there came from different places, but carried the same invisible weight. Some arrived silent, some angry, some still trembling from voices that echoed in their ears long after they escaped. Grief has a way of weaving strangers into sisters. We didn't have to explain. The silence between us spoke enough. One morning, a young woman named Carmen, barely 20 with eyes far too tired for her age, asked if I would show her how to sew. Her fingers fumbled thread, slipping from the needle again and again, until she cursed under her breath and burst out laughing. The sound startled me. I hadn't heard laughter in so long. But it was contagious, and I found myself laughing with her, surprised by the sound of my own voice. By the end of the week, 3 more women joined us. We sat in a circle, crooked stitches in our laps, sharing bits of ourselves, memories, fragments of names, unspoken pain. I didn't tell my story all at once, only in small pieces, letting silence carry what I still couldn't say. But each pull of the thread felt like I was stitching something back into place inside me. I began a new piece of embroidery on a square of linen. My hands ached, my eyes blurred, but I kept going, one careful line at a time. When it was done, I hung it by my bed. In simple letters, it read, "God doesn't delay. He stitches on his own time. When Malachi saw it, he read the words twice, letting them sink in. "That's yours?" he asked. I nodded. His smile was small, but certain. "Then I think he's right on schedule." I didn't answer, only picked up my hoop and began another line. Malachi started coming often, sometimes to drop off food, sometimes to help around the shelter, sometimes just to sit in the garden. He didn't hover or demand anything, just existed nearby, steady as a tree. Slowly, the tension inside me loosened in his presence. It was strange after so many years of fear to sit with a man and not brace myself for the storm. And then one afternoon, I saw Silas. Not my son. My son had long since turned into something harder, sharper. But this time, he looked different. He stood on the edge of the garden, uncertain shoulders, sagging beneath a weight I recognized. Malachi had brought him. I froze, panic tightening my chest, but Malachi's voice was calm. He asked for help, he said. He wanted to come here. At first, Silas stayed in the background, carrying boxes, fixing broken things, sweeping steps. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but his voice was softer than I remembered. Malachi took him under his wing, showing him how to organize the pantry, how to sit quietly with women whose voices had been taken for too long. I watched him with suspicion, waiting for the sneer, the cruel words, the storm. But it didn't come. One afternoon, I found them in the garden, heads bowed in prayer. It was a sight I never expected to see. Silas, who once cursed God's name, murmuring verses with his eyes closed, lips moving slowly, as if each word was fragile. Later, he asked me to teach him embroidery. His first stitches were clumsy, the thread knotted, the fabric puckered, but he didn't quit. "It helps quiet the noise," he admitted, and I believed him. Weeks passed. One day, I looked over and saw him threading a needle without shaking. He grinned at me, sheepish, and for the first time in years, we laughed together. Real laughter, not forced or bitter, but free. When his first embroidery was finished, he hung it proudly in the shelter's front hallway. The fabric was uneven, the thread too tight in places, but the words were clear. "The angel you waited for was a boy you already saved." I stood before it with tears burning in my eyes. For so long, I had prayed for God to send someone, anyone, to reach Silas. And now, somehow through Malachi's steady hand and the grace of time, the answer had unfolded not in thunder, but in slow, quiet steps. The boy I thought I had lost was finding his way back, stitch by stitch. The garden became our quiet place. The lemon tree out back offered shade, and beneath its branches I began to stitch my final piece of embroidery. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, falling across Silas's face as he sat beside me with a Bible open in his lap. His lips moved slowly over the words, murmuring them with care, as if teaching his tongue a new language. There had been a time when he hurled those same words like stones, but now he spoke them like seeds, small and fragile, planting themselves back into his own heart. I brushed my fingers along the faint scar near my cheekbone. It had faded, but not vanished. I didn't want it to. It was proof of what I had survived, a reminder of where I had been. For so long, it symbolized fear and silence, but now it carried something else, evidence of healing. Some wounds don't erase, they transform. Silas surprised me one afternoon. He came to me holding a square of linen stretched across the hoop. His stitches were uneven, the thread too tight, but his eyes glowed with a quiet pride I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He handed it to me. The words he had sewn were simple but strong. "The angel you waited for was a boy you already saved." My throat tightened as I read them. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And in that moment, I saw my son again, not the bitterness, not the cruelty, but the boy who once brought me dandelions wrapped in tin foil. We laughed more after that, Sometimes it was small things, the way his stitches went crooked, the way my hands shook too much to thread the needle. Sometimes it was remembering pieces of the past before anger became the only language between us. Each shared laugh felt like sunlight breaking through clouds I had forgotten could part. Malachi was always near, steady and unassuming. He fixed what was broken, carried what was heavy, and sat in silence when silence was needed. Sometimes I caught him watching from across the garden, his gaze calm, as if he knew we were walking a fragile path, but believed we'd make it through. He never demanded thanks or recognition. His presence itself was the gift. Silas began helping the other women too. At first they watched him cautiously, their trust worn thin by men who had hurt them. But he carried boxes, scrubbed floors, listened when they spoke. Slowly, walls lowered. I saw him kneel beside Carmen, showing her how to fold blankets evenly. I saw him laugh when another woman teased his crooked embroidery stitches. Malachi had once said God didn't send him to rescue me, only to stay. And somehow, in his staying, Silas had begun to change too. One evening, I walked past the chapel at the shelter and heard voices inside. I paused at the doorway. Silas was inside with Father Emmett, reading scripture aloud in a halting voice, tripping over words but refusing to give up. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," he read, stumbling but determined. It was the same verse Malachi had given me, the one I carried folded in my pocket. Hearing my son speak those words aloud filled me with something I couldn't name, part ache, part joy, part hope I had buried long ago. Time moved gently after that. Days were filled with sewing circles, shared meals, quiet prayers in the garden. Nights brought sleep unbroken by fear. My heart began to rest. I stitched one last piece on a square of linen, each thread a memory, each knot a prayer. It took weeks, but when it was finished, I hung it beside my bed. It read, "God doesn't delay. He stitches on his own time." When Malachi saw it, he read the words carefully, then smiled in that quiet way of his. "Then, I think he's right on schedule," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply picked up my hoop again and began the next line. The sun filtered warmly through the branches of the lemon tree as I set my sewing aside and leaned back, closing my eyes. Silas sat beside me, murmuring verses in a voice steadier than I ever thought I would hear again. For once, I didn't brace myself against a voice. I didn't shrink from a sound. I just listened, heart steady, the fear that had ruled my life finally loosening its grip. Some miracles don't fall from the sky. Some arrive quietly, wearing dusty boots, carrying nothing but a bag of bread and a verse that lands exactly where it needs to. Some don't knock loudly. They wait patiently until you're ready to open the door. I opened my eyes and looked at my son. The boy I thought I had lost was still here, his laughter and his faith slowly returning. My heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in years, I was not only surviving, I was living again. The seasons shifted slowly each day, marked not by dread, but by small routines stitched together like a quilt. I began to measure time, not by the sound of bottles clattering against the floor, but by the rhythm of Silas turning pages in his Bible, or the laughter of women gathered in the sewing circle, or the way sunlight stretched across the garden each morning. Life no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like something that could be lived. Silas grew steadier with each passing week. He still carried the weight of his mistakes, the shadows of what he had done, but he carried them differently now, as lessons instead of excuses. I watched him kneel to repair a broken chair for the dining room, his hands moving with a patience I never thought possible. He prayed often, sometimes with others, sometimes alone, always with a quiet earnestness that humbled me. There were days when his old bitterness flickered, but instead of exploding, he would walk outside, sit beneath the lemon tree, and breathe until the storm passed. One afternoon, he asked if I remembered the bike I bought him when he was 8. I told him I remembered saving coins in a jar, 3 months of scrubbing motel floors, for the chance to see his joy. He lowered his eyes, shame flickering across his face. "I never thanked you," he whispered. His voice cracked. "For any of it." My throat tightened, but I laid a hand over his. "You were my son. That was thanks enough." For a long time we sat in silence, hands folded together, the years of brokenness, not erased, but no longer the whole story. Malachi continued to visit, never with fanfare, never demanding attention, but always bringing something. Sometimes food, sometimes wood for repairs, sometimes just the gift of his steady presence. He spoke little of his past, but I didn't need the details. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he recognized wounds without needing them explained. He had walked through his own valleys, and perhaps that was why he could stand so firmly in mine. It was Malachi who suggested we embroider verses for the shelter walls, little reminders stitched in fabric for the women who would come after us. Silas worked beside me on the first one. His letters were uneven, but he was proud of them. Together, we hung the finished piece near the front door. It read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." Each time a new woman crossed the threshold, I saw her glance at those words, and I hoped they carried her the way they once carried me. The more Silas served others, the more his own healing took root. One evening, I overheard him speaking with Carmen in the sewing room. Her hands trembled as she told him she feared she would never be free of her past. Silas nodded slowly, then said, "I used to think the same. But someone stayed when I didn't deserve it, and sometimes that's how you start again when someone stays." I leaned against the doorway, unseen tears slipping down my cheeks. It was as if the boy who once blamed me for everything was now offering someone else the grace he had finally received. As the months passed, laughter returned to our days. Not the polite laughter I used to force at church gatherings, but real laughter, the kind that rises from joy instead of duty. I found myself humming old hymns as I worked with my hands. I even played the piano once the shelter's old upright in the corner. My fingers were stiff, my rhythm uneven, but when I pressed the keys, I remembered the girl I had once been, the one who had dreamed of music before life pressed her into silence. For a moment, I felt whole again. One evening, I sat beneath the lemon tree, Silas beside me with his Bible Malachi on the porch, sanding a piece of wood. The air was warm, the sky painted gold by the setting sun. I traced the scar on my cheekbone, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. It was no longer just a mark of pain, it was proof that even in the darkest chapters I had endured, and that endurance had led me here. I realized then that miracles rarely arrive the way we expect. They don't always come with thunder or flashes of light. Sometimes they walk in quietly, carrying bread and a verse. Sometimes they kneel to pick up bruised apples from the ground. Sometimes they take the shape of a boy you thought you had lost, slowly finding his way back home. As Silas read aloud, his voice steady and low, I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. For the first time in years, I didn't need to brace myself. There was no storm to fear, no voice to silence me. Only peace, stitched slowly into place, one thread at a time. Life had not been easy, and scars remained, but they no longer defined me. What defined me was the love that survived, the kindness that returned, and the strength I never knew I had. God does not delay, He stitches on His own time, and sometimes, if you wait long enough, you live to see the tapestry He was weaving all along. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what part spoke to you most. Your support helps us keep sharing stories of hope and healing.